Now, to help us understand the evolution from NIST 800-171 to CMMC, Dr. Ron Ross, computer scientist, NIST Fellow. Ron has served as a computer scientist and fellow at NIST for more than 25 years. He leads the Joint Task Force Transformation Initiative, an interagency working group that develops the Unified Information Security Framework for the federal government and its contractors. Ron will now speak on how NIST 800-171 came to be, why it's important, and what contractors need to know about the latest revision. Thank you for joining us today, Ron.
Wonderful. Thank you for that amazing introduction. And we're thrilled to have Dr. Ron Ross here today. Ron, very, very grateful for you giving us your time today. And I want to start off just kind of broadly. You're so well known in our industry. You've had such an amazing impact over a long and distinguished career. I'm curious, what originally attracted you to the field of cybersecurity? And then maybe too long a question, but I'll ask it anyway. How has it evolved since you first started?
Well, thanks, Eric. First of all, it's great to be here with you today and for this great event. My cybersecurity journey actually started in 1990, and it was quite by accident. I was an Army officer at the time. I spent 21 years in the Army, and I retired in 1993. But during my career, the folks at the Department of Army came to me and said, "We are starting an autonomous vehicle program, and we need some Army officers to become program managers so they can kind of oversee the development of all of these autonomous vehicles." So they said, "We'd like to send you to school," and they did. I went to the Naval Postgraduate School, and it was for a doctorate in computer science, specializing in artificial intelligence and robotics. And that's what I did for several years. The day after I graduated, I got a phone call from the same folks at the Department of Army and said, "The guy that's sitting in the position right now, he's decided to extend for a year, so go find yourself another job." Well, that was kind of just amazing that happened. But I called some of my buddies who were at the National Security Agency, and I said, "Hey, you guys have any need for computer science folks and specializing in AI, robotics?" And they said, "Well, maybe not robotics, but we do have a lot of cybersecurity stuff going on." So that's where I ended up in 1990. I knew absolutely nothing about computer security. And I walked into the building. Of course, I had to wait for my top secret SCI clearance. That took about 3 months. And I went to NIST and hung out there for a while. And I went to a couple of other cybersecurity companies who were gracious enough to give me a place to sit for about 3 months. But I learned a tremendous amount before I came into the building at NSA. And then when I got there, I ran into the world's greatest accumulation of cybersecurity talent at that time. And they were very gracious. I hung out in different offices. I talked to people nonstop. And I basically was a sieve for the first year, learning everything I could learn. But the point I try to make to younger people who are just starting out, I always say, get grounded in the fundamentals. So my fundamentals were, I started out in systems engineering, and then I became a computer scientist later. But the basic blocking and tackling of those engineering disciplines and computer science, if you have a good grounding in the fundamentals, it allows you to pivot at unexpected times. And nobody knows what's going to happen in any job from day to day. So when you've got that solid foundation, and in computer security, everything is built on electrical engineering, mathematics for crypto, computer science, computer engineering. So once you've got those fundamentals, you can pivot, and then you can start to do a deep dive on that specialty area like cybersecurity. That's what got me into the business. The second part of your question, how has it changed? It's changed unbelievably in the past 30 to 40 years. The most, I think, important change is the innovation of the technology that we've witnessed, especially during the last 10 to 15 years. The complexity of the systems has gotten overwhelming. Trillions of lines of code, billions of devices, ubiquitous connectivity from mainframes down to smartphones. Everything is connected today. And that sheer complexity has really, I think, changed how we look at cybersecurity, how we attack the basic problem set. And we're still not all the way there in that pivot and how we look. And I think maybe we'll talk a little bit later on some of those things that I think we have to do to get the ship course changed a little bit so we can solve some of these difficult and challenging problems that still exist today.
Yeah, that's amazing, Ron. I hadn't heard you share that before, that story of how you get into cybersecurity. It's amazing to me here you say artificial intelligence, 1993, and I don't think many people were talking about it at the time. And now that's all anybody's talking about, which I think
Right.
further makes your point about having the foundations, because as you go along in your career, you'll always have those to build upon. And I think for people early in their career in the audience, what brilliant advice. I think that that's amazing advice. I'd love to understand a little bit about now coming fast forward a lot from 1993 to where you are today as a fellow at National Institute of Standards and Technology. Can you share a little bit about what that means? What are your daily responsibilities as a fellow at NIST?
Well, the fellow program at NIST is fairly narrowly focused. We have around 3,000 scientists and engineers. And there are about 30 out of those 3,000 that are selected to become NIST Fellows. They could be anywhere from the physics laboratory to chemistry, information technology. That's where my laboratory is. And within that laboratory at ITL, we have our two computer security divisions. One is more fundamentals, developing standards and guidelines. The other division is kind of applying those standards and guidelines to what I call the vertical sectors like healthcare, finance, and things that apply the basics to real world problems. At NIST, I kind of have a fairly wide portfolio. I would categorize into two different buckets. I've got my day-to-day nuts and bolts standards and guidelines development, things like the risk management framework, NIST 853, the 800-171. Those are the kind of the mechanical things that we are tasked to do either through legislation or OMB policies ask NIST to create certain types of standards and guidelines. The other half of the portfolio, though, is doing research, looking at difficult and challenging problems and trying to find solutions to those problems, or at least get on the road towards solving them. And I would categorize the engineering work that I started back in 2012, which ended up producing NIST 800-160, the volume 1 and 2. Those are on I call that the below the waterline problem set, where you're looking at hardware, software, systems, how all those components are developed. How do we make sure that we can develop those components in a more trustworthy fashion? How do they all get put together with some level of assurance so they don't fail at inopportune times, especially when you're talking about critical infrastructure, the braking system in an automobile, a pacemaker in your chest. You see, we've had a massive convergence of cyber and physical systems during the past couple of decades. It's accelerated. And so the blue screen of death, which many of your listeners or viewers may not be aware of, that's when our computers used to fail. You get a blue screen, but nobody died. Today, when those computer systems fail, they are literally controlling life-critical systems, weapon systems, command and control systems, nuclear systems, the power grid, medical devices. So we have to really step up our game and not just paying attention to frameworks and controls and things that are kind of above the waterline, cyber hygiene related. We've got to get much better at applying the fundamental principles of trusted systems design so industry can produce better components, more trusted components. We can take those and put them together in systems that we understand what that system does, how it does it, and have some assurance that it's not going to fail at an inopportune time. So that's kind of are the two portfolios that I have at NIST.
Amazingly broad set of responsibilities, and I've witnessed just over the last couple of decades just the role of NIST seems to continually expand. And what I love about everything that comes out of NIST relative to cybersecurity is the practical application. Most of these things, if followed, will actually make you more secure. And so it's not about kind of compliance or regulations. It's about actually improving cybersecurity. And so you've contributed, and you mentioned a couple, to numerous NIST publications and security controls and different kind of frameworks. Is there one that stands out to you as particularly impactful?
Well, I would have to say that the two that are standing out the most early in my career was the risk management framework. That's the NIST 837 publication. And then, of course, NIST 853. the Security and Privacy Controls Catalog. Back when those documents were first developed, that was when the FISMA legislation first came out, the Federal Information Security Management Act, and then it became the Modernization Act. But the federal government at that time didn't really have a whole lot with regard to cybersecurity. We'd done some work in crypto, and we had some publications that have been ongoing for a couple of decades before. But when FISMA hit the ground, that was the call that really put us into action as far as developing a lot of the foundational things that agencies use to help build their security programs. And I think a part of that program that I'm most proud of is around 2008, we started having discussions with the Defense Department and the intelligence community. And many of your listeners may recall at that time that the DoD and the IC had different control sets. They had the DSKID 6/3 or 6, and then they had the DoD IA controls. They had DITSCAP and DIACAP, totally different certification accreditation processes. And we approached both of those organizations and said, hey, why don't we partner up? Let us develop all of your cybersecurity standards and guidelines. You partner with us, you can be around the table, you can contribute. And that way, one organization, we can have a unified set of frameworks and controls. And then you can get back to doing what you guys do best. You're fighting the wars and doing the intel and not having to waste your time with all the ancillary things that really is in the sweet spot of what NIST does best. So that's how that all came about. And then those are the two pubs that to this day, I'm the most proud of, along with 800/160. I will say that NIST 853, in its fourth revision, we're now on revision 5, there were over 20 million website hits and downloads for that publication during that Rev 4 tenure, which included about 4 or 5 years. So it's the most downloaded publication on the NIST website, and it really has been adopted not just by the feds, but a lot of folks in the private sector and worldwide as well.
That's amazing, and I didn't know that little the background to kind of DSKID 6.3 and kind of how that evolved. I hadn't heard DSKID 6.3 in many years now, actually, but I used to spend a lot of time on it. You know, and you mentioned NIST 853. It's been so foundational to so many things, and I remember having been a global CISO at a large aerospace and defense contractor. Before we have what we know today as NIST 800/171, there was a voluntary set of controls. I think it was 53, 56 from NIST 853, where the DoD partnered with industry and said, go assess yourself against these controls. That's now matured to what is now NIST 800/171. Can you tell our audience, most of our audience here today it's here for cybersecurity maturity model certification, which is really based obviously on NIST 800/171. But I'd love to hear from Ron Ross, your overview of 800/171 and kind of why it was created.
Well, 800/171 has actually quite a long history. It started, I would say, back in 2014, the initial discussions. And here's the basic problem that we had. We have NIST 853. It's aligned. We have 3 different baselines. I call those starting sets of controls. They are aligned with our 3 impact levels: low impact, moderate, and high impact, where impact is impact to the mission or the business if you have a compromise or there's a breach and your organization endures a cyber attack, and what's the impact on your overall operations if that happens. So the control sets go from low to moderate to high, and as you'd expect, as the impact level increases, the number of safeguards and countermeasures or controls also increases. So that was designed primarily for the federal government or contractors who are operating systems on behalf of the government, maybe a data center or something like that. But the other problem we had was what happens when and this is kind of along the same lines, so the controlled unclassified information executive order actually precedes that 2014 work by 4 years. It was around 2010. And that executive order tasks the National Archives and Records Administration to get a handle on all the different data types that the government was involved in. We had SBU, and there were probably 1,000 different data types. It was confusing. There was not a lot of organization. So NAR had 2 missions. One, convene all the agencies, get them around a table, and figure out how can we come up with a small set of data types that represent everything we do. And they came up with 82 categories and then subcategories of data that were under the umbrella of what we call controlled unclassified information. A lot of folks don't understand CUI is it's one of three buckets. In the federal government, we have classified information, which is controlled by statute. We have controlled unclassified information, which is controlled by the executive order. NARA is the executive agent for that program. And then we have everything else in that kind of undesignated bucket. Well, NARA did a great job at developing the categories. The second half of their mission was to define protection requirements for CUI. And so CUI in general is information that's called out by a government-wide policy or regulation or a law that talks about specific handling requirements or protection requirements for that type of data. So what they did when it came time to defining protection requirements, they said, let's just use NIST because that's already in place for the feds. And so they decided that of the three impact levels, low, moderate, and high, CUI had to be protected at least at the moderate impact level. Because if it were low impact, it wouldn't be special, and that wouldn't make sense. High impact was overkill, and so they picked the middle ground, which kind of made sense. On the Fed side, CUI then was given the entire moderate baseline. So if you're a federal agency and you're storing, processing, or transmitting CUI or any type of that information, you were already adhering to the moderate baseline. But what do you do when that CUI goes over the fence to a defense contractor or any contractor for that matter? Well, you didn't want to have to impose the entire moderate baseline. Why? Because a lot of the controls are federally unique. They don't apply to the private sector, the contractors. Also, the CUI executive order was very narrowly focused on confidentiality, protecting CUI from unauthorized disclosure. Well, our control catalog covers confidentiality, integrity, and availability. So we had a lot of controls in our catalog. For example, the contingency planning family, which were availability focused. So we got together with the DoD and NARA at the time, and we said, what can we do to take that moderate baseline and apply tailoring criteria? Tailoring is the term we use to say, you start with this and you apply tailoring criteria, which you define to specialize that set of controls down to what you really want to protect and how you want to protect it. So we threw out all the federally unique controls. We got rid of all the controls that were availability focused. Integrity kind of came along with confidentiality. It was kind of the mechanisms are pretty much the same for protecting for confidentiality and integrity. And then the third criteria, which became very controversial, it turns out, was we developed a category called NFO. These are controls that we expected the contractors to comply with, but we didn't specify them in the 800-171. The idea back then was, look, if you're operating a business in the 21st century, and you're going to have some kind of a cybersecurity program in place. So we didn't have policies and procedures. There were certain things we just didn't feel we should have to define for the contractor. So those became a tailored out category. And then whatever was left, we basically used our FIPS 200 and our control catalog to develop a set of requirements. We call them requirements, not controls, to distinguish them from the controls. And we try to make them as simple and straightforward as possible, even though the 110 requirements were substantial. And if you're operating a big company or even a medium-sized company, and you've got an ongoing program, those things are probably things you're doing for the most part. And I would recommend, even if you're not under contract, those are really good practices to protect your business today, no matter what kind of business you're operating. But for smaller businesses, it became a problem because a lot of them didn't have the resources. And so that's not a problem that NIST could solve. That was going to be a problem that had to be solved by the federal agencies who were the sponsors of that CUI going over the fence to the contractors. And by the way, that's still an issue today in the Rev 3 update. That's kind of a little history.
Yeah, no, well, it's an amazing history. And I think one of the things it does, Ron, for those who don't know, is just illustrates the amount of thoughtfulness and time that went into this from many parties, including industry. There's always been opportunities to comment. And so, I sometimes run into folks in the industry who feel like geez, they're suddenly throwing this NIST thing at me and what CUI, and there's actually a long history of thoughtfulness of trying to make this fit, but it's very hard. There is no one size fits all. So I think that kind of overview really shows people the amount of time and attention and thoughtfulness over many, many years that have gone into this. You mentioned small businesses. One of the challenges, whether you're kind of one of the top 5 aerospace and defense contractors in the world, or you're a 15-person machine shop in Iowa, it's the same 110 requirements. And so
Yeah.
I'd love to hear your perspective on some of the key challenges organizations face when implementing NIST 800-171, and any thoughts you have on how to overcome them, because I agree with you. It's generally just best practices that you should be doing regardless of what size business you are.
Well, I think, the first thing we have to do, I think, in discussing the small business or just the implementation of the requirements in general, is this is without a doubt one of the most difficult and challenging problems that the country faces today, not just because of CMMC and the 171. All of our companies today who compete and are doing business using the modern technology, the most expensive investment companies make is in research and development for the innovative products that they're producing. So the fact that we have adversaries out there, we know who they are, and we're under a constant, continuous barrage of cyber attacks. It's almost heartbreaking to see the intensity and the level of attacks that are occurring and the direct connection to our national and economic security. In other words, all the great technology the warfighters use, all of those weapon systems and that modern technology, there's a tremendous investment by the defense industry, defense industrial base, in producing and getting that technology manufactured. When the adversaries come in and steal that technology, they don't have to invest all that R&D. They can just go back and take that stuff and manufacture it. And that's why you see a lot of the different weapon systems of adversaries today look a little bit like our stuff, maybe a lot like our stuff. And it's not just the military aspect, it's any kind of innovation where our companies are competing worldwide. Our military strength is directly tied to our economic strength. If you don't have a robust economy and you can't protect your intellectual property and your companies are not thriving, well, then the military is going to suffer on the other end of that. They won't have the latest technologies. And so this is all connected together. And the other point I would make is that we are all one team. Whether we're in the federal government side, which I am a part of, whether we're in the private sector, the defense industrial base, or whether we're in academia, where we're building the next generation of scientists and engineers and entrepreneurs. All of us are on that same team, and this is where we need to find solutions that work. And so the biggest challenge, obviously, is a lot of organizations do not have robust cybersecurity programs. We assume they did, but they just don't. And that's not to point fingers at anybody. Even the people who do cyber for a living every day in the federal government has big cybersecurity programs, and we get hit and we get breached. So this is not a gotcha drill as much as how do we get a reasonable set of standards and guidelines, prioritize the things that we know add value first, and then continue to build that program out. It's like any difficult and challenging problem. You could apply this to the 110 requirements in 171. If you can't get them all done right now, the first step is to take stock of where you are. What things can you do quickly to add the most value, whether it's two-factor authentication or encrypting data at rest or developing a good incident response plan. You can break up all those requirements into, I call them the triage, the third, critical, not so critical, and then everything in the middle. And then just get on the road, that plan, and start moving from left to right, building that program. I think every organization, whether you've got lots of resources or a few resources, can develop that kind of a plan. It just may affect how quickly they get to that endpoint. But we're actually building these programs while we're under attack every day. And that makes the problems, it exacerbates those problems. But, it's not going away. We have to be clear-eyed. We have to be able to make tough decisions. And one of the things we try to do with any document that we develop at NIST is we have a literal partnership with our customers. Every one of our pubs goes out for multiple review cycles. We're going through that big public comment period now. We got almost 1,700 comments on the initial draft of 171 Rev 3. We look at every single one of those comments, and the ones that are in scope, we address. And sometimes we don't do exactly what the commenter would like because we're balancing all of our customers' needs. And that's a difficult and challenging job, but that's what we signed up for. So that's how we do business. But that partnership, public-private sector, I can't think of anything more important, because with our customers' help, these documents get better with every iteration. And without our customers, we really couldn't do what we do.
Yeah, I've seen it, Ron, firsthand from multiple sides of kind of the table over the last 15 or so years, that that public-private partnership, I think one of the things that is unheralded maybe outside of the defense industrial base and industry is the public-private partnership. I don't think it gets enough credit. The maturity of just getting to a NIST 800-171 and then having it put into DFARS and then now getting to the place of CMMC, all of that is a result of just such an incredibly robust public-private partnership that works. I don't think it gets enough credit. And you mentioned how you kind of perceive and you, I guess, the consumers of a lot of NIST documents as customers. Talked to Steve Shirley, former executive director of Defense Cybercrime Center, now with NDISAC. We had NSA as part of the conference as well. And the theme that we consistently hear from everybody is that it is a partnership. And I think that kind of customer mindset, it's there. And I want to share that and just highlight and foot stomp that a little bit with the audience, because I think that I don't think, frankly, the federal government gets enough credit for this aspect. And I think they have been very good partners in that regard. How do you think NIST 800-171 has actually impacted the handling of and security of CUI, controlled unclassified information, since its introduction? We've had it for a while now, and like I said, some folks feel like CMMC and these new, air quotes, regulations are a surprise, but they've been here for a little while. Have you seen an impact in terms of their effectiveness?
There's definitely been an impact. I think the first thing, a lot of people confuse the types of publications that we produce at NIST. I've heard 800-171 referred to as a standard. It really is not a standard. It's a special publication, a guidance document. We have basically three types of pubs at NIST. We have standards, which FIPS 140, our crypto is a standard that's mandatory for all federal agencies. But we have a whole host of special publications, 853 and 837, and a whole bunch of other ones. We probably have hundreds of those special pubs. And the third type are what we call NISTers. They're interagency reports. They're more of, I would consider, research and development type topics. We're looking at new things. We want to get some things published, and that's kind of how we convey those new ideas. But a lot of people think that 171 is a regulation or a standard. It's just a NIST special pub. Now, what gives it the force of the regulation is when an actual regulation like the DFAR or the FAR calls out that publication, that special pub, in its regulation, points to it. I call that weaponizing in this special publication. And once that happens, those 110 requirements now have the force of the regulation behind it, or it could be a law even that could be referencing a NIST publication. So it's important to remember that. And I think the impact has been widespread, even though implementation, I think, has been uneven across the community because the small businesses, medium-sized businesses, it's not always the easiest thing to get accomplished, but people have been on that road for a while now, and there are many companies getting it done. When I used to travel a few years ago, when I would go to Japan or to Europe, it's surprising how the 171 is part of the discussion internationally now, because a lot of our defense industrial base, and they have partnerships with other countries, and they're the militaries of the different countries are collaborating, whether it's through NATO or some collaboration over in the Far East. So those kind of foundational cybersecurity publications, they work their way into lots of different nooks and crannies. But the impact, I can say, having talked to many companies in the DIB, outside the DIB, inside the federal government, dealing with their customers and the contractors, it's definitely made a difference. Now, are we all the way there yet? No, I think you can look at any of these audits, like from GAO or anybody that's actually checking to see how the implementation is going, well, you're going to find, like you always find, there are people that do it really well, and there are people that aren't doing it at all. And then there's a whole continuum in the middle that are on that road toward where they want to get their eventual goal. So it's been good, but I think we have, I think the future is where the action is for the 171, because we're going to start to see it in more and more things like the DFAR and the FAR and things like that. And that's going to keep that pressure going out across all the contractors and all the non-federal organizations.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting idea, that kind of weaponization. I think we've seen a lot of forced curiosity because of the regulatory requirements. And so I do find every company tends to be on a different place in the journey to compliance, but I am optimistic because I think almost everybody, to generalize, is further along that they would have been, I think, had we not had NIST 800-171 and the weaponization through the DFARs. And so it's forced curiosity and a lot of implementation. One of the questions I get frequently is the alignment of NIST 800-171 with other international standards for data protection, cybersecurity. Does it align at all? Does NIST do anything to kind of do that mapping for an interested organization?
Well, it's kind of a complicated question. Certainly, most things end up going back to 853 as kind of the source document. 853 was where we started. When we tailored, we ended up with 171. You see that things like the cybersecurity framework, they reference 5 control sets. One of those control sets is NIST 853. There's that connectivity there. We've also done mappings from the cybersecurity framework to NIST 800-171. And then in the back of our publication, in Rev 2, we had a mapping, obviously, from the 171-110 requirements to their source controls from 853. So there is a lot of connectivity. I think a lot of it goes back to the source 853, but there's also other touch points that are more indirect. For example, NIST 853 kind of competes with ISO 27001/2. Many years ago, we looked at using that ISO standard, but it wasn't robust enough for the federal government. We had a lot more requirements and controls we needed to address across all of our families, our cybersecurity families. And when we did the mapping many years later from the NIST controls to the ISO 27000 series, there were a lot of blank spaces on the ISO side because that catalog was, I would say, written at a higher level of generality. It wasn't as broad or as deep as we needed. So that distinction has kind of maintained over the years, but we still do mappings from our current catalog to the ISO 27001/2 because a lot of our customers deal in the ISO environment, especially companies that are selling globally. They prefer to have that ISO connection because that kind of goes worldwide. But nonetheless, we try to maintain that connectivity across the different frameworks and sets. But it leads to another interesting point that people brought up during our call for comments last summer. They said, you guys at NIST have great frameworks, but you got a lot of them, and a lot of them are duplicative. So they said, could you look at kind of condensing and collapsing? So when we started the Rev 3 update, we said, since 800-171 is derived from 853, why don't we think about over time moving those requirements that we started from 53 and moved to the 171? Let's start to move those back to the original language of 853 because that's where it starts anyway. It would make it less confusing on our customers. It would be updated immediately because every time we update 853, we got to do a 171 update. So it's great to have the different frameworks, but it introduces a level of complexity and maintenance that I don't think anybody wants to do long term. So that's one of the reasons why for the Rev 3 update, we started to announce the notion of a CUI overlay based on 853. We're not going to go back all in one fell swoop, but you can see with the initial public draft how those generalized requirements, which were fairly simply stated, are now a little more granular. And there's a reason for that. We can talk about some of the reasons why we did that. I know there was, I think one of your topics you wanted to discuss was the Rev 3 changes. So we can talk about that when it's appropriate.
Yeah, no, I'd love to, Ron. That's what was one of the things I was going to ask is tell us about kind of the latest changes and updates to NIST 800-171 Rev 3 and that organizations should be aware of. It's a great time for that.
Well, so, that kind of following on from that point, we look at the requirements, and the requirements in Rev 2, they're solid requirements, but they're written at a level of fairly high generality because a lot of them the basic requirements came from FIPS 200, which is our highest level of requirements that were written. They were never intended to have the specificity for implementation. The document that takes care of implementing the FIPS 200 requirements was the 853. That's where you started to get more specific granularity. So, for example, we had a very high level requirement for access control in FIPS 200. But that access control requirement, that general requirement, was backed up by an entire family of security controls in the 853 that did a deep dive on account management, access control, information flow, all of the things that are in that family. And the way federal agencies would satisfy the FIPS 200 requirements is they would implement the controls from 853 in one of the three baselines, low, moderate, or high. So now, once we created 171 and we see those requirements written at that level of generality, some of the things that we observed in our discussions and also in our discussions with the agencies and the private sector is when those requirements are written at a very high level of generality, implementation can become a problem because you can read the very simple requirement and then have some questions about what does this actually mean? How do I implement this? So that's one group. You can think of that as one side of the coin. That lack of specificity caused ambiguity, a lot of implementation issues. The other side of the coin is assessment. We have these requirements, we have controls, and then in our risk management framework and most of the frameworks, there's an assessment piece. You tell people what they have to do, and then you have to come in, whether it's an independent assessment or whether it's a self-assessment. You got to figure out, are those requirements or controls implemented correctly? Are they operating as intended? And are they actually supporting my security policy that I've defined? So the assessors had a really difficult time. Now, we did provide some assistance in Special Pub 800-171 Alpha, because that ended up defining all the assessment procedures, the determination statements, and all of that granularity started to appear as we broke those requirements down into assessment procedures and all the objectives and the different objects and methods that we use to do those assessments or the assessors would use. So in order to not continue down this road in difficulty, starting to move the language back to 853 gave us a little more specificity of requirements. Now, the other thing that happened when we did that is we introduced something that is called an organization-defined parameter. You can think of this as in a statement or a requirement or a control. Part of that control might be considered what we call a variable. For example, if I tell you you've got to back up your systems, and then I put down periodically, for example, well, that's going to give you a lot of wiggle room to figure out how often I should do that. So an organization-defined parameter, we put an assignment statement in there, and it would say, back up your systems, and then assignment would be organization-defined frequency. So you could say, I'm going to back up my systems every hour, or you could say, I'm going to back up my systems once a month. But once the organization defines that parameter, that value, that becomes part of the requirement, and that's a legitimate part of the assessment. Now, we left the organization ambiguous as about who that organization was, because in 853, when it applies to a federal agency, those parameters are defined by each agency as part of their security plan. The problem becomes now when we're doing it in 171, since this could become part of the DFARS or it could become part of the FAR, you now have a set of parameters which allow you flexibility on one hand to define those parameters that really speak to your mission or your business operation. But the reality is that these contractors may have several different agencies they're dealing with. Maybe they have a defense contract. Maybe they have a contract with NASA. And now the problem becomes who defines those organization-defined parameters. The federal government always has first right of refusal on those, but if they choose not to define it and they pass it down to non-federal organization, then they can choose to define those any way they want. So in Rev 3, we got a lot of comments on the ODPs, and we have to address those. One of the options is that we're looking at is to reduce the number of ODPs. I'm not sure how many there were, but there were quite a few because they all came from 53. The other option is having some kind of an organization that sits above NIST, because NIST can't define those for everybody. If we were to set a parameter value, I guarantee you, one person may like it, we would have 100 people that say that didn't fit my needs. So the idea is you have to get an organization that kind of sits above the federal agency level, whether that's NARA as the executive agent for the CUI program, whether it's OMB, could be the Joint Task Force, which is one of the groups that brings together all the agencies in developing the NIST standards and guidelines. There are lots of different options there, but that's one of the key issues that came out in the public comments, and we're having to wrestle with that now. We don't want to give them up altogether because there are legitimate needs to have those ODPs. We just have to find out the kind of the sweet spot for having flexibility and yet having some certainty on behalf of the contractors on they're not going to get jerked around and have different values to deal with for different customers.
Yeah, I think a lot of work, Ron. I mean, it's great to understand kind of a little bit of how the sausage is made, and again, the thoughtfulness that goes into it. And I think one of the things that's very helpful is that organizations do have a level of flexibility. And I think, and of course, things never move as fast as you like, but I think that there is an effort to kind of have some level of harmonization so customers aren't kind of, having to jump through different hoops for essentially the same kind of requirements. And that brings me to a question. I'd love to hear your thoughts between, we have NIST 800-171, and then obviously how that interacts with broader landscape of cybersecurity regulations, executive orders, et cetera. What are your thoughts on, are we moving to a place where we end up with, for lack of a better term, one standard for all federal government contractors? It seems to me, certainly we're definitely moving towards a space where I think in my lifetime, to be a federal contractor, you're just going to have to meet mandatory minimum cybersecurity requirements, as I think you should. I'd love to hear your thoughts on that kind of landscape of cybersecurity regulations in the U.S. and maybe where we're headed.
Yeah, it's hard to predict. Regulations and laws and policies are really out of the NIST realm. We're non-regulatory, so our job is to develop the standards and guidelines. We're mostly technically focused in that regard. But I think minimum cybersecurity standards sound great, and they would be helpful, but you have to really get together and find out who's going to agree on what the minimum is. That's one of the reasons why 853 ended up as it did, because we have such a diverse set of federal agencies, all different shapes and sizes and different missions. And the ability to define one set of cybersecurity standards and guidelines that would really be appropriate for every federal agency would be an impossible task. That's why we ended up with the risk management framework, and we have the cybersecurity framework, and those are all customizable frameworks. 53 is customizable through tailoring and all the things. So the idea was to be able to give our customers, and I use that term very broadly, it mostly applies to the feds, obviously, but we have a lot of customers that go well beyond the federal government, well beyond the United States. So being able to give customers what they need is a really important objective for NIST. And how do you do that without being too specific or too general? Each one of those options is not good. Being too specific kind of constrained solution sets never turns out well. Being too broad, anything works and anything is going to solve the problem. And we know that's not true. So I think you may see some consolidation over time. One of the consolidation points may be working 171 back toward a CUI overlay carved out exactly from 853 controls and getting the same requirements that we have today, but expressed in a little bit more akin to the 53 language. That helps the feds because they're used to 53, and even a lot of our private sector customers use 53 as well. So, I mean, it's a tough call. You want to do the right thing. And we do rely on that feedback to help us kind of work our way through those really difficult decisions. But, standardization is great. I don't think you're going to see it across the board for a while yet because there are just too many things in play. We have the ISO standards, we have IEEE, we have the NIST standards, and where we have opportunities at NIST to eliminate duplication. NIST doesn't like to create standards if there's already one that satisfies need in the ISO standards or IEEE or one of those types of standards that we can rely on for our customers. So it's a tough call, but I think long term we have to kind of start moving in the direction that you suggest.
Yeah, I can appreciate the difficulty of that task, Ron. I mean, it's amazingly complex landscape, and there is as I did another one of these interviews. I think Steve Shirley, I've stole a phrase he uses frequently, and I think he shared who he stole it from. Is like, there's 0% chance you'll make 100% of the people happy all the time, and I think you articulated that for sure, and that you'll have whatever you do, there'll be some kind of criticism, fair and not. Ron, you've been super generous with your time, and this is I've been actually fascinated to hear some of these things because just the understanding of how it works and the interrelationships and how NIST thinks about things and all the different kind of customers that you have to interact with, I think is incredibly useful for our audience. I wanted to ask you one last question, though, around just what advice would you give an organization who's just starting their journey to being compliant or in alignment with NIST 800-171, not from a regulatory perspective, but just from I have 110 things I need to go do. That's overwhelming. Where do I start?
Yeah, I think the first thing is to kind of get into the right frame of reference, frame of mind. And what I mean by that is I think it's important to understand our complete dependency on this technology that we use today. No matter what your business model is or what kind of business you're involved in, you are 100% dependent on that technology being reliable. So even if we didn't have the CMMC program or we didn't have the NIST standards and guidelines, there would be a need to protect your critical information, your business assets from these ongoing cyber attacks. So understanding the level of effort that the adversaries can go to and the kinds of attacks they can launch, the sophistication, just understanding what can be done to you. And the other part of that would be the fact that it either already has happened to you and you don't know about it, or it's going to happen to you. So preparing your company to survive in the 21st century is, to me, job number one, from the board of directors all the way down. Now, having gotten your mind and your head in the right place, then you've got to figure out what are your protection needs for the company. Now, sometimes your protection needs are going to go back to you're required to comply with certain laws or regulations or policies or industry standards, or maybe you're regulated by one of the federal agencies in the energy sector or whatever it might be. So there could be some starting touch points of standards, guidelines that you have to implement in order to be compliant with whatever your industry sector might demand. But again, even if you're not in that particular group of people, just figuring out what you have to have on the foundational set of things to make sure your business can survive. And so that gets us down to, let's say, 171. And that's the kind of the focus of the CMMC. Right now, we got about 110 requirements. You may be starting from ground zero, literally with nothing in place. On the other hand, you may be, one of the big 5 or 6 defense contractors who have very mature programs. You have to figure out where you are on that continuum, because that's going to kind of determine your next step or even your first step. And I would say, going back to what I said earlier, is no matter what your problem is, and this is a difficult one, challenging, it's going to cost money, resources, time, people, skills, expertise. Figure out how to divide what you have to do into some manageable chunks. It's kind of a classic problem-solving technique. You divide and conquer. You don't try to attack the whole problem at one time. You carve it up into manageable pieces. And then, especially if you're going through a company approval process where you have to get resources for every step of this process you've defined, but put it into an organized plan with milestone points and things you can actually achieve. And then once you do that, you've got to figure out what are your most critical safeguards or countermeasures that you can put in to the company immediately. Even if you got 110 to do, there are certain ones that are going to provide high value, a great level of protection, and maybe not the greatest amount of resource expenditures. I think one of our federal CIOs back in 2015, we had the OPM breach, said we were on the journey toward two-factor authentication. We started in 2008. And in 2014 or 15, we were only, the DoD was like 95% compliant at that time. The rest of the government, 35% compliant. So, we sent a man to the moon in less than 8 years, but it took us 10 to get two-factor, so figure that out. But so the federal CIO said, if you were to do this one safeguard, this one security control called two-factor authentication, it would eliminate 50% of the successful cyber attacks and breaches. So that's one thing that takes out half the problems in the attacks space. So figure out what things are most impactful. I would say two-factor is one of those. I would say least functionality, least privilege, making sure you get rid of all the people who don't have to have all the privileges. Get rid of all the unnecessary attack surface, applications, data, devices, servers that are either not used or not critical. So there are certain things that a lot of these are defined in DHS's, the top 20 things they look at. And to me, that's a great place to start. And then when you get those critical things in place, that's a milestone point. And then maybe you go back and ask for additional funds after that, or at least tell people in the organization, hey, here's my plan. I'm 1/5 of the way there now, and I need more funding, or I need some really good pats on the back, or hire some more people, or give me a raise. But let me know I'm doing okay, because this is a tough task, and we're all on the same team, and we're all trying to get to that end point, and everybody is on a different journey, a different cadence, different levels of resources, but sometimes people are going to need to have them help getting there, because all these organizations don't have the same level of funding or resources. So, but that's where I would start, and then take an honest look back. Once you go through your milestone point, assess where you are. Does my plan still work? Is it still relevant? Do I need to adjust it? It's the same thing in our engineering work that we do under 160. We go through 30 different processes, and every one of those is kind of a relook all the time. You do a little bit, you assess where you are, you go back and circle back, make adjustments. And that kind of process, I think, will get you toward the end. I don't think it'll be easy, but it'll certainly be thorough and with eyes wide open, with all the stakeholders, from the C-suite all the way down to those folks on the, I call those the grunts. They're in the military, the infantry. Those are the folks who actually do all the work. They're in the trenches. And my hat goes off to every one of those folks out there. I always say my job is the easiest job. The people who are the CISOs, cybersecurity professionals, whether they're writing policies or doing firewalls or zero trust architectures, these folks work really hard. They don't get a lot of pats on the back a lot of times, and they're the first ones to get blamed. It's not a job that a lot of people are envious of, but they still do it every day. They get up and they do that heavy lifting. I am extremely appreciative for what they do, and I'm never going to forget their contribution.
Dr. Ron Ross, that's an amazing kind of summary and very practical view on the way to kind of eat this elephant one bite at a time, with an assessment, having a plan, measuring yourself against the plan, and then using the kind of outcome of the plan to get more resources. And it may take you several budget cycles and several years, but just the idea that you have a plan, you're measuring against the plan, and you're demonstrating progress, I think can get a lot of companies there. Again, Dr. Ron Ross, you've been very, very generous with your time today. I think this has been an amazing session for our audience today, and I want to thank you again for doing this.
Thanks, Eric. Thanks for having me, and I enjoyed it thoroughly. Take care.
Thank you, Ron, for that informative question and answer session. Understanding how we got to where we are today helps the DIB prepare for future compliance requirements.